Hello everybody and welcome to Elevate GM's first spot with our travel consultant, Scott Hadden at Mark Bratt Travel. Now, it might seem a little bit strange to you that in the middle of a pandemic, when travelling to the living room might be as far as many of us have gone, that we've decided to incorporate a travel spot on the Elevate GM calendar. The reason that we were really passionate about doing that is it is a sector that's come under an enormous amount of pressure. Because we're not travelling, because we're not doing all those normal things, there is clearly not the same revenue going through the travel industry. But at the same time, travel consultants such as Scott are being called upon more and more to offer advice and to help people who have been caught out by various different restrictions. So what we're going to do today is have a talk about, what the reality is for the travel industry, and particularly looking at that from the perspective of an independent travel consultant. I think the headlines have been somewhat dominated by the bigger players in that space. We're then going to come on to talk about the current restrictions. We're not going to go into massive details about which countries are on which list, because by the time you watch this will probably have changed. But we'll hopefully give you a bit more of an understanding about what those restrictions mean and how you can make sure that if you are planning on travelling or you do need to travel, that you can do that as safely as possible and make sure that both your personal health and your kind of financial health are well looked after as best as we can. And then in the final section, we're going to have a little look forward into what travel looks like for the rest of this year and going into 2021. So, Scott, as I mentioned, Chief Experience Officer and Director at Mark Bratt Travel. I've had the pleasure of working with you as a customer over the past couple of years, and we've obviously stayed in touch throughout this pandemic. So I've had a little bit of an insight into what your world has been over the last 6 months. Can you give us a bit of a summary, I suppose, going right back to March when all of this hit? What did that mean for you in terms of what was keeping you busy? What were kind of the big stress points then?
Sure. I mean, obviously, for a lot of these answers, I'm going to try and talk about travel as a whole industry, which is obviously encompasses a lot of different factors. But obviously, for this one, in our experience, we're a small outbound agency, so we send people to every continent, tend to do relatively complex trips for people. So touring the Peruvian jungle, for example, which, as you know, Lona. So for us, as it's happened and unfolded, we had people stranded or potentially stranded across 4 continents, so time zones from Panama 5 or 6 hours behind to New Zealand 12 hours ahead. So the reality for us was that meant incredibly long days, 20 odd hours, where we were having to work with obviously an ever shifting nature as the world was literally closing minute by minute, hour by hour, getting people home from Panama, rerouting them via America. Literally within an hour of doing that, finding the American have rescinded all ESTAs, so they couldn't even transit via America, which when about 95% of Panama flights go via America, makes it quite difficult. Thankfully, we got everyone home, which was obviously our first priority. So for everyone in travel at day one, it was absolutely crisis management and prioritizing those away. Of course, for the larger companies, what that meant was all their resources were used on, well, hang on, we've got, we could have 10,000 people in Spain. What does this mean? People going the next day couldn't get through because of all the resources, and of course led to frustrations and anger amongst customers. So, and that was a sad reality and echoed across pretty much everyone. So that was phase one. Phase one was getting everyone home, getting them safely. Our customers in New Zealand were literally on the last flight off New Zealand. Yeah, that was very, very stressful.
And I should just say, just to interrupt you there, that I know that you personally weren't just helping customers coming home. I know that your Twitter feed was inundated and offering advice to people who'd travelled with all kinds of different companies, suffering those frustrations that you mentioned. So not just busy with your own customers on those 4 continents, but also doing what you could to kind of bring everybody else home at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, we had we had trade lines rather than consumer helplines. So we'd spoken to people, we'd obviously already researched some of these things about what the situation was. So, and the problem was, of course, the situation for people was changing so quickly. and they just couldn't get through. So it seemed the sensible thing to do is just to tell people what we knew and give them some advice. So, helped as many people as I could, both in terms of did I think their trip would happen and what they should do to ensure that, you don't want to do something that would stop you getting your money back, for example, and also helping some other people try and get home from their situation. But yeah, and I wasn't the only one doing that. Travel agents up and down the country were pretty much just in full on, let's get everyone, let's stop anyone leaving who shouldn't be leaving and get everyone back. But and it was a hugely stressful time. I mean, literally just didn't stop. And as I said, it was hour by hour, the situation was changing. And I think our view ahead of the global ban coming was probably echoed by other people in travel, that actually at that moment in time, it made it easier. It made it easier to just know that no one was going anywhere, and we could just focus on managing everyone, telling them what the situation was, and sorting out their bookings, rather than just phoning someone in the morning and then phoning them in the afternoon. And to some degree, that hasn't actually changed. We recently last week we booked someone a trip to Istanbul, and then within 2 hours had cancelled it and refunded it because Istanbul was added to the quarantine list. So that was very much phase one. And then second phase, of course, was, as I said, sorting out all those bookings. So going through everyone, making sure we avoided hitting payment terms and cancellation fees. And obviously there was often very, very long wait times. So you could be on the phone to, a supplier or an airline for hours. And that's not a criticism of them, but, you can imagine every single person trying to get on an Emirates flight, trying to phone Emirates at the same time. The reality is, however good an airline you are, you're just not going to have capacity to speak to everyone. So it was, every trip and every booking took a long time to sort out, and obviously then also notify our customers and let them know what was happening. So phase two was very much about cancelling everything down, minimising our costs, but then also ensuring that we got money back to our customers as quickly as possible. We were incredibly lucky that our customers were hugely supportive and understanding, but we have, also, we have been able to refund everyone, which is great. But at the same time, it is what our legal obligations are. So, that's, we say it's great because not everyone has been in that boat. But yeah, so that was very much phase two. Phase three has been trying, where possible, to make some money. So, which has been challenging as countries and destinations have been added, and then some of them taken off almost as quickly as they came on again. So, for the whole year, the travel industry has been under great strain. Not only has, revenue's been, for many companies, such as ourselves, almost zero, but we haven't been able to the luxury of just necessarily furloughing loads of staff, because actually we've been very, very busy, and some redatings have happened more than once, people needing to get away and then can't. So people are now on their third or fourth redating, all of which takes time and effort, which you cannot do when you're furloughed.
And I think that's so important to note, because there is, quite rightly, and we've covered it within Elevate, a focus on the impact that this has had on hospitality in particular, that they are absolutely at a crisis point now. But actually in the earlier phases of this pandemic, they were closed. So you weren't paying staff, you could furlough people, and no, that's not ideal in any way, but travel didn't even have that necessarily, because people such as yourselves, busier than you've potentially ever been before, you need to be there on the phone doing the emails, doing all the work, but none of that work is revenue generating. No. And sadly, we've seen, companies such as STA Travel that, have not been able to survive and get through. And I know from our conversation before, it's how lean and agile you are as a business that's enabled you to keep going to this point.
Yeah, I mean, we're lucky that we're a small firm focusing on a small number of bespoke trips, but obviously travel is a huge industry. So the really big companies so far have been able to ride the storm because they thankfully will have funds and maybe access to additional funds, but that's not something you can do forever. It's not a sustainable business model. People in the middle, margins are tight for travel agents. Many will take 10% on a holiday. And for many people, ourselves included, we don't see that money until people are back from their holiday, which is an increasingly the way travel companies are run. And this is the right way to run a travel business because it protects the consumer's money, which is a far better model. It helps avoid the Thomas Cook debacle. Obviously, Thomas Cook name is back now, but it's a separate company. So, we've been encouraged rightly to run through trust accounts, which means the customer's money is protected until after the trip. But it means if you were to book a holiday for next year, tomorrow, I don't see that money until the day after you come back. So as you can imagine, for our forecasting as well, how do you run a business and plan a business knowing, well, we might have a departure next week, we might not. We might not have a departure for 6 months or 7 months or 8 months or 9 months. And in the meantime, we have to pay our staff, our suppliers, and everything else. So you can imagine for companies that when you get to a scale and you've got rents and other costs, it just becomes, after a few months, there's just no money left, and with no income on the horizon, the sad reality is that administration beckons, which, as we've seen, STA are probably one of the best known and best loved names that has fallen. And unfortunately, there's a risk, like in many industries, a whole generation of first-hand knowledge and experience will disappear from the travel industry unless we can do something about it.
Absolutely, and I think again it's something that we've seen across a few sectors, that we are at real risk of losing, not just the knowledge and the expertise, but travel is something that it inspires such a passionate workforce that most people who work in travel do it because they love travel. I've booked through SDA in the past, and the passion and knowledge that they have that's why you go to them. That suddenly, if we start losing those people now, yes, they may be able to go and retrain and go into other industries, and for the individuals, that's absolutely what you want for them, to be able to go and find an industry that's more secure at the moment. But as a consumer and as a kind of a society, we are losing an enormous amount of knowledge and passion there. So just on that kind of knowledge point, so I think most people would expect from your travel agent that they'll know about the destinations, they'll know about the holidays, and you have all these, lovely conversations with your travel agent about which hotel you want to stay in and which animals you want to see and all that kind of thing. The conversations that we probably don't have are the ones around insurance, protections, all that kind of stuff, because until it matters, it doesn't matter. And then almost overnight, that's become a bulk of the inquiries. So as we said, depending on when we'd filmed this, the list of quarantine countries would be different, even from morning to afternoon, let alone from week to week. So not going into the detail as to where people can travel, but can you talk through a little bit about what it actually means if a country joins the quarantine list for somebody who's already in that country when it goes into quarantine, or for B, as somebody who's booked a holiday to go to that quarantine country? What does that restriction actually mean?
Sure. So in essence now, there's always been, it's actually just been renamed FCDO. They've added the word development in, but people will have heard of FCO advice. So before this happened, there were always some destinations that are against FCO advice. And these are normally down to either political instability or perhaps whether the British government doesn't have a very good political relationship with the country, or where there's been a severe act of, like a hurricane or something like that. So as you can imagine, at any one time of about 200 countries that we follow, there's maybe 40 or 50 of those that might have some restrictions on, but in reality, they're places that most consumers don't rush to take a booking to. Never before have we seen places like, France, Spain, and countries like that added to the list. So the creation of the travel corridors was to basically, in March, the world was closed. Every single country had a travel ban. So at that moment in time, the world was in effect shut. Of course, it's not against the law to travel. We'll come on to that in a minute. But in effect, they were saying there is nowhere safe to go because of the pandemic. What the government did was create what has been dubbed these travel corridors, where they relaxed. So basically said it is now safe once more to travel to this country. And what's more so is you do not need to quarantine on return. So that's quite clean. That's like traveling like it is before. You go to Italy when it's free in a travel corridor, you have your holiday, your normal insurance works, and you come back and you can go straight back out to see your parents or whatever, in line with local restrictions. So there are some countries where it has now been dubbed that it is okay to go. So your travel insurance will cover you to go to that country, but where they're saying the COVID risk is still high enough that you need to quarantine on return. So that's the second tier, and they haven't used that tier very much. So there are countries open with a standard insurance policy, but where you have to isolate for 14 days. What they have been doing is when they've removed countries from the travel corridors due to worsening COVID restrictions, is to put them back onto the no-go list, so to speak. So that is where they're saying it is now against Foreign Office advice to go. Most package holidays, not all, are sold in line with Foreign Office advice. So where there is a Foreign Office advice warning, that holiday normally will not go ahead. So the issue has been if you have a trip to Spain booked and Spain goes against Foreign Office advice, there becomes question marks over whether that holiday will happen. And it's happened on a level that's never happened before. Normally, when these bans have come in, they're one-offs, the rest of the world is open, and it's quite a severe reason why you can't go. So people don't want to go. The issue we've had now as an industry is the market is split. Many people still want to go to Spain, but perhaps their advisor won't, their travel agent won't sell them the trip because it's against Foreign Office advice. If you are in a country at the time when the Foreign Office advice changes, your travel insurance normally will continue to be valid. That's the default setting. I won't say always, because there are a whole host of insurance policies out there, and I'm sure some of them go against the norm. But in reality, if you're already in a country and the government changes its advice, you are covered for the duration of your stay. You may, of course, be asked to come home early, depending on flight situations and whatever. The issue you have is if you haven't gone and you still want to go, each company is now doing their own thing. If you've booked it yourself, of course, then unless flights are cancelled, you're unlikely to get a refund. But there are now insurances coming to market that will cover you for going against Foreign Office advice, where that Foreign Office advice is only linked to COVID. So, for example, as it stands today, Spain. The only reason you can't go to Spain is because of the COVID outbreak. So you could get an insurance policy to cover you for tripping down the stairs and breaking your ankle. It would cover you for that.
Brilliant. So
I think it's quite complicated. Hopefully that makes sense.
It is very complicated, and I think you did a great job of explaining there. So essentially, if you've travelled somewhere and that was fine at the time of you going there, you would expect that your insurance would kick in as normal and would cover you for everything. But caveat, everyone should always check their policies anyway.
Sure. And I'm not a qualified insurance professional, but absolutely.
No, absolutely.
And increasingly, I would say, it's unlikely now for your holiday to be cut short because of COVID if you're already out there, because most of the airlines have, taken the view they have to keep flying. The hotels and restaurants are all open. Normally, what happens is, before COVID, it tended to mean something else was happening in the country, and therefore you couldn't guarantee delivering that holiday safely. But that's not really the case anymore. So normally, what
kind of moved from one-off emergency, haven't we, to kind of this ongoing changing beast. So if somebody then has a holiday booked, either themselves or through an agent that's still prepared to go ahead, the extra insurance that you mentioned, presumably that wouldn't cover somebody if they flew to Spain, for example, they've got the extra insurance. If they were ill and hospitalised in Spain because of COVID, would that then sit outside the insurance? That's the bit that it would exclude, or is it just they're happy to cover everything?
Again, there is a whole range of insurances, and obviously the more you pay, the more it's covered. The new ones that come into market for the mainstay are covering you for everything except catching COVID when you're away. So it covers you for, as I said, fall down the stairs, twist your ankle, something like that. It would cover you. Most of them are excluding COVID. However, to complicate matters further, some airlines are covering people for COVID. So Emirates and Etihad, for example, up until the end of the year, if you fly with them, you are covered for any COVID-related costs that you incur whilst away. So if you're quarantined or you're hospitalised in a country because of COVID, they will actually pay for your treatment. And many local governments are doing this as well to keep the tourism open. So Madeira and some places in the Caribbean are also doing that as well. So it's worth looking at, either speaking to your agent, who can obviously maybe know this firsthand already, or can do some research for you, or looking at the small prints. No one's ever wanted to look at small prints so much in their life, have they? Of either airlines, or look at the local tourism websites, and often they will tell you what they are doing in ways of protecting tourism, particularly where tourism is a really, really big part of the economy. They want to keep the doors open, and for most tourists, the chances of catching COVID during that 1 week sitting on the beach is probably not that high. You know, that's not where the outbreaks are happening, so they're probably happy to take that risk.
Absolutely, and I think great to know that there's all those kind of different options. And like, can you have imagined a year ago having a conversation where it's like an airline will cover your costs of getting ill in a country? It's like that just would never have been a conversation that we'd have had. And it's how all of those companies are adapting. So there's just a couple of things what you said that lead us on quite nicely to the next section, which is about kind of reopening travel up. And I think the first one to be aware of is that I would assume that what would make things easier for the travel industry, and I'm saying this to someone who sits completely outside it, is that those quarantines would be more localised than full countries. If we look at the differences in rates across the UK, we're sitting here, me and Wigan, you in Manchester, kind of looking at the rates around us, and we're at a very, very high rate at the moment. If you look down towards, you know, the south coast, much lower rates. So that presumably is the same across different countries. And if you look at somewhere where we talk about mainland Spain and Spanish territories, can be hugely different. Do we think we will see a move towards those being more localised, or is that just going to complicate matters even further?
So an announcement in September was the ability to segregate islands from the rest of destinations. That actually worked, you could say, against the favour of the travel industry, because what it meant was that they allowed mainland Greece to be exempt at the time, but put quarantine measures in place on some of the islands. And the reason for that was, of course, like you were saying, you know, rates vary hugely across countries, and particularly so on an island. So you've got, you know, the Canary Islands are, 1,000 kilometres from Spain, so they are able to have either a worse situation or a better situation. So the first step was to allow islands to be monitored separately where the data allows it. So, you know, the challenge we have, and don't want to try and get onto politics, but, you know, in reality, you know, everyone's having to make decisions very, very quickly, and they're changing very quickly as well. First of all, the data has to be there. So the data has to be transparent, that the data has come from island A to be able to make that decision. Not all countries are reporting their data in the same way. So where there isn't segregated data and it's just across the whole country, we have no, we see at the moment that the government are going to do the default of we can't tell, therefore we have to quarantine the whole country. I think that so far the government has ruled out regional exemptions. Now, if we go back to pre-COVID, there are often regional travel bans. So, for example, many countries might have a regional ban where perhaps, if we take Turkey has a regional ban in the border with Syria for obvious reasons, because there is an area of conflict there. So that is quite common. Now, as you can imagine at the moment, with every country being monitored and every country changing every day, that becomes a lot harder to administer. So I think the reality is we probably will not see regional bans unless there is, the sad reality probably is, it's probably not going to be led by science. It's probably going to be led by other factors. So I know New York are pushing, for example, for an exemption to a travel ban for America and to create a travel corridor between London and New York. There are obviously a lot of political hurdles to overcome with that. That may happen. I think the other thing that might happen is, so this is recorded on the 7th of October, and the rumours are circulating today that we are finally going to have a separate government think tank around outbound travel, and separating it from just looking at us with transport, which are obviously connected, but two completely different sectors. One of the things they are talking about is the ability to start testing on arrival and reducing the quarantine duration period. I think that is probably much more likely, and of course can be applied at a global level. So i.e. wherever you've been, you may now, the hope might be that you only have to quarantine for 5 days instead of 14 days, which starts to make more of the world accessible again, because a 10-day holiday with 5 days quarantine is much more doable than a three-day holiday and a 14-day quarantine. A long weekend in Prague becomes 2.5 weeks off work, which is, just not.
Absolutely. And I think whilst, so many of us have moved towards working from home, and you perhaps think, well, I could isolate and it'd be fine. Obviously, not everyone is in jobs where that would be possible. If you've got children in school, obviously that becomes much more difficult. So the next step then is kind of looking ahead. And, if we had a crystal ball and we could look ahead, then, wouldn't that be amazing? Because there's a lot of questions that we'd like answering. But I suppose what I kind of wanted to end on is looking ahead to what is this going to do to the travel industry long term? We spoke earlier about, there's a huge issue in terms of cash flow. As even if you were busy with bookings now, you're not going to see that money for some time. We are at a risk that the only people who are going to survive, the only businesses that are going to survive, are going to be those kind of huge corporate beasts that have those kind of funds behind them, which is great. And obviously there's no business that we want to see fail, but at the same time we don't want that to be all that's left in our travel industry. You mentioned earlier on around kind of booking holidays to the Peruvian jungle, and count myself very fortunate to have been able to go on that trip, not least because we snuck it in a few months before the pandemic hit. But one of the things that really struck me was how important tourism is to that country, not just in terms of the finances. So, going through Lima, and it's got, these phenomenal world-class restaurants that, exist because of the foreign travel that goes through that city. It's a real global city. But talking to people who were working on the treks that we did around Machu Picchu, people who were working in the jungle, that tourism had to be a viable industry so that people wanted to protect the country. That if gold panning in the Amazon and putting mercury literally into the ecosystem is the way that you can support your family, that is what you'll do. If protecting the rainforest because people want to come and see it and enjoy that biodiversity, then that becomes another viable option. So I was just wondering if you could kind of talk a bit about how countries are relying on tourism, and how as kind of independent operators you're able to offer something a little bit different to kind of those large scale package holidays that we see.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, travel is a really vast sector, and there are pros and cons to all bits of it. We specialise in a relatively small area of that, and what I want to say is that to some degree, all travel should be able to be viable and find its own path, and every sector within travel will have, after the pandemic, also having to balance with sustainability and all other issues. I mean, the figures in terms of tourism, very, very difficult to actually sort of work out exactly where it sits. But you could, there's rumours that 1 in 10 people in the world are employed by tourism in some capacity. That's a phenomenal number of people, and whether that's someone picking your bags up at the airport for a couple of pounds, or a specialist tour guide, or people in a country running an inbound agency, again, it's massive. I mean, you alluded to about the jungle, and also I'd say wildlife is tied very much into this as well. The African wildlife is, people pay, it's $1,500 to go and see a gorilla in the wild in Rwanda, and if tourism is not funding that, the risk of those being poached becomes higher, and long term you worry about the impact this will have on wildlife. It remains to be seen what will happen. I think everyone, whether the pandemic was in place or not, there is a growing trend, and I think the pandemic will speed that trend up rather than actually start it, of people looking at their connection with the world across absolutely everything they do. I mean, home working and remote working was increasing anyway. It's just going to be massively sped up with the pandemic. So what I'd like to, I think it will be a shame if only the huge players are left, because, well, what appeals to 900,000 people and gets, put on a website of that scale is very different to be able to find the perfect trip to you. And you might have a really, really niche interest, and everyone should be able to go and see the world the way that they want to see it, So the impact is potentially massive. And obviously, even the big companies, very few of them own all the infrastructure abroad. Some do. So, obviously people like TUI own an airline, so that allows them to offer very good prices. But, most of the pieces of any holidays is many layers and many pieces of a puzzle. However big the travel company is, that hotel is owned by someone else. And if that person loses their appetite to keep hosting people or putting money into a hotel and the hotel closed down, or the staff closed down and maybe that area becomes less popular. So the knock-on effect is absolutely huge. So, the stress for the travel industry is not going to go away. There has been some respites, obviously, for some people that perhaps sell a lot of short trips to Europe have seen some bookings in the summer, but obviously well down. People doing short breaks in the UK have seen some resurgence, but have also lost all the American tourists and all the Chinese tourists. So, there isn't a complete rosy picture for anyone. So I guess what I'd like to see happen is, from a personal point of view, is I want people to maybe reassess why are they traveling and what do they want to get out of it. To me, to go all the way to, Peru probably wouldn't be a place where you do this, but then just go and stay in one hotel and fly home starts to seem to be, well, hang on, there's been a lot of uncertainty, am I going to make it? To me, it's now about helping people have a real experience in a country and to bring some of that country and the ethos of that country back with them. And I hope that really, this can reignite people's passion for travel. The fact that we've had 12 to 18 months of very little travel, what I hope is that we go back and we travel with the right intentions, that just like here, where there has been a shift towards buying the coffee from the local shop rather than the big chain. Big chains have their place, not about that. But, what I also hope is that people decide and go and stay in the smaller privately owned hotel, to go and eat outside the hotel, to get a local taxi or a tuk-tuk ride. It might only be £2 or £3, but that £2 or £3 to that person is going to make a world of difference. And, the stories we're getting from our suppliers around the world are really, really heartbreaking. We were fortunate enough to be able to run a virtual safari earlier this year whilst the world was closed, which was a really nice experience for us to be able to do, and some schools put it on for their entire classes, which was wonderful. And we decided to run it as a donation, and for example, that game camp went to donate food to the local community because they were all involved in tourism, and for 4 months there hadn't been anything, and the families have no other source of income, and not every government has the ability to pay their citizens not to work. So for many parts of the world, these companies don't have anything to fall back on. So the risk is twofold: is we need the companies to survive here, but we also need the suppliers and the product to survive there. And the longer this goes on, the risk is, of course, that options get corroded as well. And I really hope that we can find some middle ground so that we can do some travel in some capacity while still protecting public health before it's too late.
Absolutely, and I think it's that balance, isn't it, that we know we're going to be living with this for some time. We're in no way want to be like, open the floodgates, let's try and get back to normal, because that's going to be devastating in every possible way. But at the same time, as you say, if some of those decisions being driven politically rather than by science, if we're not taking account of the whole infrastructure and the whole kind of ecosystem around an industry, it's quite hard sometimes to make sure that the right decision's being made, because we're perhaps focusing on one bit and not understanding the wider impact. So that's been phenomenally useful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. The Zoom Safari that you mentioned, I was very pleased to take part in it, and it definitely made me want to add Safari onto my list when the world opens back up again. So I know you are looking at doing some similar things in the future, so as and when you do, please let us know. We will be there and watching, and also very happy to share out for you. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Scott is going to join us on a regular basis and is happy to answer any questions. It is an incredibly quick moving world around travel, so what we'll be focusing on will be some of those broader issues rather than specifics, but as Scott has said, across the industry there are a load of very, very passionate, very knowledgeable people. So if you do have any kind of specific queries, please do follow Scott on Twitter. I'll include his details when we share this out. I know that he regularly updates as and when countries are added or removed from quarantine lists, so it's a good place to keep up to date with everything. And if you do have any questions that you'd like covering, just drop us a message and let us know. And I look forward to seeing you all hopefully in the real world soon.